rather than surrendering to their charm offensive, it's important that they surrender to the pressure that can be brought to them to have them abandon their nuclear weapons program.
Every time Iran's nuclear program is brought up, we hear language like that from Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and various hawks around the world. And if we said that there was a Middle Eastern country that had built a nuclear bomb using technology either stolen by spies or provided by its closest allies, then you'd be forgiven for thinking we were talking about Iran. The country we're talking about has built up an arsenal of between 80 and 150 nuclear warheads. It's carried out nuclear tests despite a ban, but it never signed up to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. The materials and knowledge it needed to build the bomb were sold to it by the US, Britain, Germany, France, and more, all of them campaigners against proliferation. And even though the nuclear program was exposed by a whistleblower nearly 30 years ago, the state still refuses to confirm its existence. The state we're talking about is Israel, and its nuclear secrets are still preciously kept, despite the fact that they're out in the open. In 1986, an Israeli nuclear technician called Mordechai Vanunu handed details of the program over to the press in Britain. He's been called a hero of the nuclear era by Daniel Ellsberg, but Israel took a very different view. He was abducted in Italy by agents from Israel's spy network Mossad and taken back to Israel, which is illegal under international law. He was then sentenced to 18 years in jail in a trial held behind closed doors. He served 11 of those years in solitary confinement, and since he was released in 2004, he's been re-arrested and re-imprisoned time and time again, and has also been branded a traitor. So even though this information has been public since the mid-80s, the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, still fails to acknowledge the program actually exists. But this is what we do know for sure. The Israeli Atomic Energy Commission was formed in 1952 and immediately worked closely with the military. Within a couple of years, Israel was able to extract uranium found in the Negev desert and was able to produce heavy water. Believe it or not, the US hasn't actually always been a close military ally of Israel, and successive presidents, Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson, all told Israel no when it came to nuclear bombs. It was actually France who were the biggest contributors in terms of manpower and expertise, despite publicly being against proliferation. Israel reached out to France for help in designing and building a reactor at Dimona. Construction began in the late 1950s, but Israel claimed the site was either a textile plant or a metallurgical research facility. The US weren't convinced and flew U-2 spy planes over the site, and in the 1960s, inspectors were sent in, but they couldn't find any evidence of weapons-related activity, partly because it's reported the Israelis built decoy control rooms and bricked over access points to parts of the facility during the inspection. But there was also willful neglect. Between 1963 and 1964, Israel purchased yellowcake from Argentina. Now, yellowcake is the commonly used name for uranium oxide, which is critical for fueling a nuclear reactor, and therefore for producing plutonium for weapons. Canadian intelligence discovered the purchase and passed information on to us Limeys and the Yanks, but we decided not to do anything about it. In the Historical Dictionary of Atomic Espionage, another acquisition of yellowcake is detailed. The LeCam spy ring purchased 200 tons of the stuff from Belgium using a freighter registered to a front company in Liberia. The boat turned up in a Turkish port without its cargo after it was transferred to a separate vessel somewhere in the Mediterranean. The Israelis obtained heavy water from Britain and Norway with only one check carried out by the Scandinavian partner in the deal on whether or not it was being used for weapons. By the late 1960s, the CIA and the Nixon administration knew full well that Israel had the bomb. But they feared public knowledge would disrupt the nuclear non-proliferation treaty they were about to sign. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger advised that Israel should make no visible introduction of nuclear weapons. And so they kept stum. And it's from that moment on that US involvement began to grow. Another LACAM operation set up a partnership with the US-owned Nuclear Materials and Equipment Corporation. Officially, at least, they were investing in the irradiation of fruit crops. Although actually the boss, Dr. Zalman M. Shapiro, who was a vehement Zionist, was actually diverting nuclear fuel to Israel. When it was finally discovered, the company was fined $930,000 because it couldn't account for the missing uranium. And then much more recently, there's Stuxnet. Stuxnet shut down 1,000 centrifuges in Iran's nuclear enrichment facilities and forced the Iranians to suspend work at the plants. At the time, Stuxnet was the most complicated computer virus ever discovered, and it made its way into all sorts of places around the world, but its target was Iran's nuclear facilities. There were a lot of theories about who developed it, but last year Edward Snowden revealed to Der Spiegel that Israel and the US had created it. Remember LACAM, that spy ring that we mentioned earlier? Well, they'd managed to obtain through bribery the blueprints belonging to Urenco, a European uranium enriching company. Those exact same blueprints were also stolen by Abdul Qadir Khan, a Pakistani who helped his own country develop their enrichment program. He also sold the plans to Libya, North Korea, and Iran. So Iran and Israel had exactly the same uranium enrichment facilities, and that explains how the NSA and Israel were able to develop a code that exploited 20 zero-hour weaknesses, because they knew the system inside out. And this isn't all a thing of the past. Although Israel has largely stopped illicit procurement of nuclear materials, an Institute for Science and International Security report found evidence that through legal cases and US sting operations, the country is still making the occasional illicit procurement. And all of that raises a lot of questions. Why is it that Israel, the US, the UK, France, and more still refuse to talk about the weapons and their involvement in developing them, especially when the information is so public? Why is it that Israel's secret nuclear program was tolerated, but Iran faces heavy economic sanctions when it says it's not even after a weapon anymore? And perhaps we should also be pondering, who's the real nuclear threat in the Middle East?